Hello and welcome back. We are working on our sortable component in this latest lesson. And in this video, we're going to be looking at improving this even further because although we have created a pretty cool sortable component that I can pick up and reorder my favorite food in this very simple and as always silly app, there's certainly some improvements that we could make to this sortable component that we have built. First of all, I want to point out an issue that you may or may not have noticed if you are working along, and that is that we are currently in our script, if you remember, whenever we run our sort method right here, you'll notice that we are using the insert adjacent element, and we are always inserting after end. And that means that whenever you drag a sortable, so if I pick up pizza and I drag it over hamburgers, I move it down after hamburgers because we're inserting adjacent after end. And that works great. When you're dragging downwards, you can see it kind of is logical wherever I drag pizza, it's going to end up after the element that I drag it over top of. If I drag upwards, however, you will notice when I drag over tacos, pizza did not move. And I would kind of expect pizza to replace tacos when I'm going upwards. But because we have hard-coded that after end, that means that everything I drag over top of this pizza element is always going to be after it, which means that I can't even make pizza the first element. Even if I drag over hamburgers up here, I can only go after hamburgers. So if I actually wanted to make pizza first, I would have to let go and then drag hamburgers down because really you can only move things down the way that we've built this, and that's certainly not ideal. What I really want to do is whenever I pick up an element, if I were to move it upwards, then I want it to replace the item above and go before that element. Whereas if I were to move it downwards, I want it to go after. So I want it to kind of switch back and forth between after end and before begin when we use that insert adjacent element based on the direction that we are actually dragging. And there's a number of ways you could accomplish that. You could certainly capture the Y position of the mouse cursor on start and then capture it again every time you sort and kind of compare that. But honestly, I think it's a little bit easier to basically, because we can use this for other methods later on, other improvements that you might want to make, is to basically create a method that's going to very quickly just get us the current index of an item inside of the sortable, and then we can use that method to kind of compare is this index that you're dragging before or after the index that you're dragging on top of the other element you're moving towards. And then that way we can just basically say if the index is greater, that means we're moving down. If the index is less, then that means we're moving up. So I think that's going to be simpler. And then like I said, that could potentially be a method that you could use for other things down the line. Like if you ever need to get the current index of something, it's going to be very easy to do that. So let's create that method first of all, and then we'll figure out how to implement it into this sort method to improve that. So what we're going to do is we'll create a method. We could call this get child index, or maybe get sortable index. And this is going to accept an element, which is going to be like a sortable. And we'll write a JS doc signature up here for HTML element. L is the sortable list element. And then this is going to get the given element sortable index. And this will return a number because again, we want the index of the element that we provide to this method. And then in order to get the index, we should probably check to make sure that we're actually dragging something because we could potentially try to be iterating over elements that are null. So first of all, let's just set if this.state sortable list is falsy. So that sortable list we saved that we're using up here in our sort method, if that is equal to null, or if it is falsy, then let's just simply return 0. So we're not dragging in this case. And if that is truthy, that means we have an active sortable list. So let's go ahead and determine which item you're actually dragging. And in order to do that, we can basically iterate over this sortable list's children, because that is what contains all the sortables in our unordered list. And we'll say whichever one equals our current dragging, or not the current dragging element, but this element that you pass here, that's going to be the index that we return. So let's add a comment that says get element index. So we'll say for let I equals 0, I is less than this dot state dot sortable list dot children dot length. So we're going to iterate over all of its children, and then we'll do I++ to keep incrementing the index as we go through that. And then if this dot state dot sortable list dot children of I is equal to the element that you've passed to this method, then we can return I. And that's going to take care of it in most cases. If for some reason you didn't you didn't configure this correctly, or you pass in an element that's not actually a child of the sortable list, I don't know why you would do that, but just in case, let's just say in the case that it's nothing is found, again, let's just return 0. So like if you have an error or something like that, let's just make sure that this still returns a number, so we're not throwing any errors anywhere in our application. We'll just kind of assume that it's the first item if for some reason you've configured this incorrectly. And now with this method in place, let's go back up to where we are starting our drag, so our drag start listener. And what we can do is after we have gotten our dragging element and we've gotten the sortable list, let's go ahead and get the dragging index. So let's create a new state variable that's basically going to store what index you are currently dragging. So this.state.dragging index is equal to this.get sortable index of e.target. So it's going to take our current dragging element and it's going to set this dragging index to, like if it's the first item, it'll be 0. If it's the second item, it'll be 1, etc. It's a 0-based index that's telling us which index we actually picked up when we started this drag listener. And let's also make sure that that is persisted in state. So up here, we'll add dragging index is initially going to equal, I guess, undefined. It's probably the best thing to put there because technically a number is not nullable, I don't believe. So we want to set that to undefined. And then also when we end our drag, so this method right here, we want to set that back to this.state.dragging index is equal to undefined once again. So we kind of set it back when we're done dragging. But now that we have that in place and we are in our start method, we are setting this dragging index. That means we're going to have that variable when we go into the over method down here. So it's going to pass all these checks. It's going to go into the sort method, which now we have our current dragging index. And now we can actually determine if we're dragging upwards or downwards. So let's create a variable to store that, a Boolean variable that's going to tell us, are we dragging upwards or downwards? And so we'll say dragging upwards. And so we'll create const dragging upwards equals this.get sortable index of the target, which we're passed here. So it's going to take whatever you're holding. Remember, this is the target over which the current draggable is held. We're going to take the index of whatever you're holding over, and we're going to compare that to the dragging index in state. So you're dragging upwards if whatever you're holding over has a smaller sortable index than your current draggable, right? Your dragging element. So that means if this.get sortable index of target is less than this.state.dragging index, then this is going to be true. So we are going to be dragging upwards. Otherwise, it's going to be false. And then we can now use this Boolean value down here to change it to a ternary operator. So again, the options are, if we bring up our autocomplete here, we can do after end. So that's going to put the element that you're inserting, the adjacent element, after the element that you're held over, or before begin. Those are the two that we want to use. So what we can do is we can say, are you dragging upwards? If so, let's do before begin. Otherwise, let's use after end. And then at this point, the this.state.dragging index will have changed, right? Because what we did is we removed that dragging element and then we moved it over top of this other element. So let's just make sure that we get a new index. So we will save new dragging index, this.state.dragging index is equal to this.get sortable index of this.state.dragging element. So it's going to take that new element that we created and it's going to get its index and make sure that we keep that right here. And let's make sure this works. Now that we have saved this, let's go back here. Let's pick up our tacos, make sure we can still move down. So you can see I moved below burritos, but I also want to make sure I can move up, in which case it does actually work. So you can now actually drag and drop both downwards and upwards, and it's going to work just fine, which is what you would expect. It's definitely something you want to do inside of your sortables, is make sure that you're not always inserting before or after. You're actually taking into account which direction the user is intending to sort. And there may actually be cases where you're for whatever reason, you want to implement a horizontal sortable. So in this case, we're vertical. And the reason why I like to use this index, this get sortable index, is because it doesn't really rely on the presentation, like whether or not the sortable is horizontal or vertical. It only relies on the actual HTML order of those elements. If you were to like do something where you check the Y position to determine whether you're dragging upwards or downwards, it's not going to work on a horizontal sortable. So just through a simple CSS change where maybe you're moving things left to right as opposed to up and down, you could break your sortable component, which I think that's a big reason why adding this method is going to be the preferable way to go. I think it's going to be a little more performant to compare the Y position because you get that data on every event that is fired off, so you don't have to do any sort of calculation like we're doing in this get sortable index. So it could potentially be faster to do that. So it's still an option that you could take if you wanted to do that. But again, I kind of like the method that's always going to work regardless of our presentation. So in this case, we'll stick with our get sortable index method, which is going to work well for this particular sortable. Okay, and another thing I want to do to improve this sortable is I want to give it some more visual feedback while we are dragging. So right now you'll notice I get the nice little hand cursor. If I pick up the waffles, it kind of changes into this cursor, which is a little bit weird. It doesn't look like I'm dragging, but also I think it could be very easy to kind of lose where waffles is ending up in the list. Like if you move your cursor over to the right, you can kind of clearly see where the waffles are as I move up and down. But if I'm holding it right over the list, it's almost like you can't see the waffles because it's covering it up with this ghost, if you will, that's hovering over the page. So I think it's really important to add some sort of state or class that changes the presentation of the dragging element to really let users know, not only, first of all, that you have a new cursor you're grabbing, you have picked up an element to make that really obvious, but also if you are to let go, this is exactly where that dragging element is going to end up. You want to kind of highlight where you're actually dragging it to. So let's add a couple of minor, what I'll call minor CSS updates and class changes based on the state of our sortable. So what we'll do first of all is inside of our class and our constructor up here, we currently only have these three configuration options, the attribute, onsort, and sortable container. Let's also add a new attribute called dragging class, which will be dragging by default. So it's just a string value of dragging. And we can actually add that CSS class to the sortable container whenever we begin sorting, and then we can take it back off whenever we're done sorting. So that's pretty easy because we already have a start and an end method that we're listening to. So what we'll do is we'll remember we have this.config.dragging class. And let's go to our start method first of all, which is right here. And we'll come down to the end of this method and we'll say add classes, this.state.sortable container.classList.add this.config.dragging class. So we're going to add classes to begin with. Sortable container class list add. That's going to, again, it's going to add it to the sortable container itself. And then let's go to our end method down here, and then we will remove classes. So that'll be basically the same thing that we had above, except instead of using class list.add, we'll do class list.remove. And then you'll see if you look in the inspector, if we look at our sortable up here, as I pick it up, you'll see it gets dragging. And as long as I'm dragging, we're going to have that dragging class. And if I let go, it's going to fail because I did this after we set sortable container to null. So that's pretty dumb. Let's go ahead and move this up obviously that's going to have to go before you actually set sortable container to null. So let's make sure this works now. So again, you see sortable, you get dragging. If I let go, dragging is going to disappear. So that's always, that class is only going to be in place whenever we are actually dragging an element. And then up here in our sortable class, we'll say when this has a class of dragging, then we'll take an unordered list and override its cursor to be grabbing. So again, the grabbing is kind of the closed fist sort of thing. And now you'll see as I pick things up, you get a nice little sort of grab motion where it actually is going to turn into a closed fist, which is what we want from our cursor. But again, I also want to make sure that the current list item is kind of highlighted, especially as you move it around. So let's also make a change to that in our sortable.js. So this is going to be kind of similar, but we want to actually add a class to the current dragging element or the draggable itself. So maybe we'll call this dragging element class. And we could give that a default value of, I don't know, drag, something like that. Or maybe active drag, whatever you want to do there. So we're creating this new dragging element class, and then we'll add that to the dragging element, right? This guy right here that's inside of state. So let's do the same sort of thing when we add classes. We will do this.state.dragging element.class list.add, this.config.dragging element class. So we'll do that on start. We're doing that in the start method. We're going to add it to that one. And then on end, of course, we're going to do the opposite where we're going to remove that class. So you'll see here, rather than being added to the div itself, if I pick up the first item, which is tacos, you'll notice in the dev tools over on the right, we actually get an active -drag class. And then you'll see that moves up and down as I'm moving this element up and down in the dev tools over to the right there. And then if I let it go, it's going to remove that class. So now we can use that class in our CSS to basically say when you have a list item, but it has an active drag class on it, we could set, usually what I would do is just maybe a background color. Background color could be set to primary, for example, and then that's going to be really obvious. You'll see it kind of highlights it behind the scenes, so it's really hard to miss. Probably in this case, let's add a transparentize of 50% or something to that, so it's not quite as bold. But now you'll see, like, even when I'm covering over the elements behind, it's really hard to kind of lose where I'm going to end up if I let go. Like if I drag up here, it's highlighted down there. I can see exactly where I'm going to be when I'm done sorting, and I let go, and it's going to go back to just a normal white list. With a white background. And I think this works much, much better. It's going to be really obvious to users what's actually going on. You get the nice cursor when you're dragging up and down. You get the nice highlight when you're moving things. It's just going to work so much better if you just spend a little bit of time to make sure these, what I would call state classes, are added to your sortable component. And then you can give the user that much more feedback while they're actually performing sort operations inside of the sortable itself. So we'll call this lesson complete, and we'll come back to our sortable in just a few moments.